This is a diagram that gets referenced often in the industry and often whenever the topic of circularity comes up. And it's something that was developed by Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which, as you probably gathered from the report, is really one of the leading NGOs working in the non-government organizations, nonprofits, essentially working in the circularity space and supporting the industry in this space. And really the point of this diagram is to illustrate that there are two different circular cycles that we have to think about. And it's when you start to mix these cycles, that's when true circularity or sort of cradle to cradle types of concepts become really challenging. So the first one is biological cycles. And so that's really looking at natural materials, so extraction of feedstocks that can potentially go to biogas, but really then regeneration of those materials and feedstocks in the biosphere, collection and farming of those feedstocks, and then going into the manufacturing, for example, of a material or what they're calling a part in this diagram, through then into a product. So making those materials or parts into a product, and then potentially through to a service provider. This is obviously a general model, not specific to the apparel and textile sector, but and then of course through to consumer and then the collection phase. And the idea is that you want to minimize the leakage of materials or products out of these two cycles. But of course, that's what we're seeing a lot of today, is that most things are sort of what we would call leaking out of these cycles. And then on the technical cycle side, it's a similar concept where, you know, you're refurbishing, remanufacturing, reusing, redistributing, recycling, whatever that product is. It's then going back into you know, a material, then through to a product, then potentially through to a service provider, back to the user, collection again, and hopefully the collection enables that product or material to stay in that cycle. So it's just thinking about these two different loops or two different cycles distinctly. And a specific application of this, when you start to think about the challenges of not keeping things in these two distinct cycles, is when you think about blended materials. So a polyester cotton blend, where typically on the polyester side, you know, you would really be in that recycling cycle. But for cotton, you know, certainly you also have the opportunity to produce cotton regeneratively or whatever the case may be. So initially you're producing that cotton in this biological cycle, but then it's sort of getting put back over into this technical cycle, and you're trying to recycle it. And that's where you're seeing some of the challenges today with trying to recycle cotton infinitely. For example, the staple length, the staple fiber just breaks down, and it's not to say that that technology can't be resolved in the future, but it's just really challenging today. So it's just a really interesting way to frame more broadly, again, beyond the industry, the two different sort of cycles of circularity we're talking about. So regenerative or biological cycles, and then technical cycles, which is generally the sort of reuse, recycling type of area, which can actually be, again, from biologically based materials, but it's just thinking about two different definitions of circularity, so to speak. So, okay, so the next slide then, what is a circular economy? So again, according to Ellen MacArthur Foundation, I really like their definition. They base it on 3 key principles. So it's making sure that we're eliminating waste in the cycle of a product, making sure that we're continuing to circulate those products and materials at their highest value. So, you know, ideally not this sort of concept of downcycling, but continuing to maintain them at equal or higher value. And then regenerating nature, which is all about that sort of biological cycle again. So I really like this framing of a circular economy in terms of these 3 concepts. And one other thing I'll flag here is that often when we think about circularity or a circular economy, regenerative agriculture doesn't necessarily come to mind. We typically think more of, you know, again, either material circularity, so recycling of materials, or we think more about sort of keeping, again, circular business models, keeping products in use longer, you know, refurbish, re-commerce, that kind of thing. It's a newer concept to also include regeneration of nature as a circularity concept. So a lot of times what you hear now, and you're seeing this with the EU Commission as well, in terms of a lot of the policy that's coming out, they're framing their broader sort of umbrella of sustainability policy at the EU Commission. They call it the Circular Economy Action Plan. And really what they mean by that is not only this idea, more traditional idea of a circular economy, but also the sort of regeneration of nature side of it as well. So just something to keep in mind, the sort of evolving definition of what's encompassed in circularity or a circular economy. And then this is a slide that I actually put together when I was at VF, and I found it really helpful to talk internally within the organization about where circularity fits within basically the sort of life cycle of a product. And so I'll walk you through this diagram as well, and then I also like to use this to help explain where a lot of some sort of representative organizations that are in the circularity space fit here. So really, of course, you start with product designing of a new product. Then you're looking at, first of all, you want to design for using as few materials as possible. So what we call dematerialization in the product design process. And then when the product goes to production, you want to make sure you're as efficient as possible with the materials that you have selected to go into that product. And that's where things like marker efficiency or pattern efficiency is another way to say this comes in. As well as just in general concepts around production scrap recycling. So making sure, any sometimes you'll see like tote bags made out of scrap fabric from a brand, outdoor brand supplier. That's a great example of what's happening there. And then when you get to, understanding exactly, that, okay, so you have to use this certain amount of materials, you've been as efficient as possible with those materials. Then what you want to do is make sure that you're selecting, when you have to use materials, that you're selecting the best possible options from a sustainability perspective. And that, as we've talked about in the past, is really on the natural material side, are they sort of regenerative or organically produced, being produced in harmony with nature and having the least possible impact on nature, or are they recycled? And so everything in green here, by the way, is really what we would typically consider. And now actually, so this diagram was developed about 3 years ago. Now I would also highlight actually in green, this concept of regenerative as well, because that's really getting more and more formally put in to a circularity definition. So this is, you can see the kind of real-time evolution of this concept. But then moving on from material substitution, then of course you've got your product, you've used the best possible materials choices within that product. Then what you want to do is make sure that you're keeping that product in use in its current state in its first life as long as possible. And that's where things like warranty come in, repair programs, of course, rental programs, designing products to have multiple uses so you can actually make less products because, ideally products are being used for more than one purpose. And then this is also where I would say durability comes in, which is also ultimately a circularity concept, because it's all about keeping products in use longer and maintaining that embedded energy that's in that's already been expended to make that product and extract the materials and so forth. And then you've got product longevity in terms of, in its current state, but additional lives. And that's where things like re-commerce platforms come in. Other, obviously secondhand channels, outdoor gear resale stores, your traditional consignment shops or thrift stores, et cetera. And then also there's some really interesting and innovative work happening now around multi-life customization. So, taking an original product from its first state and its first life and really making it into something completely new. And I know the North Face has done some really cool programs with some designers on this, and a number of other brands have done some, mostly small capsule projects, but pretty interesting stuff. And then once that product has gone through as many additional lives as it possibly can, and it can no longer feasibly be used as, as a product in an additional life, then what you want to do is make sure that those materials get diverted into a recycling stream. And today there's typically two categories of materials recycling. So chemical recycling and mechanical recycling. So chemical recycling is really where you're actually breaking down a fabric or blended fabric back to the essentially the polymer level, or really the base level of what's going into that material. And this is often where things like separation of blended fibers come in, is really through chemical recycling concepts. And then mechanical recycling is really more where you're looking at, essentially shredding a material back down into, really small shreds that can then be put into a new fabric, or a new, if you're talking about polymers as well, that's going to be primarily chemical recycling. Although I guess there is some sort of shredding of, rubber, for example, and things like that as well. And then, ideally within all of this, you have product and material recovery or collection mechanisms or infrastructure. And that's much of what really needs to be built out in the industry today. But then ideally, again, as you're recycling these materials, then they're hopefully going back into this material substitution phase, right? So again, looking at really closing the loop once those materials have been designed once, and sort of extracted and used in their first life and additional lives, trying to keep those materials in use as long as possible. And then when we start to think about, as we've talked about in the past, compostability, biodegradability, other these types of issues, that's, again, that concept of leakage, right? So really the true end of life, or that leakage of products in an ideal state, should be minimal. And that's when, concepts like compostability or biodegradability, or in reality, incineration or landfill, then come in. So, again, a key point there is that we shouldn't, from my point of view, we shouldn't necessarily be designing for compostability or biodegradability as the ideal state. We should really be thinking about designing more for a circular ideal state. However, in some cases, if we know the reality is those things are ending up leaking out of the system today, that can be a beneficial way to think about it. So it's just all of these trade-offs, in terms of how to keep products in use as long as possible, and the realities of the system and the lack of collection mechanisms today. And then just advancing here, again, it's just a really kind of an illustrative way to look at categorizing the different types of initiatives that consider themselves circularity initiatives that are out in the world. And this is just a very small representative sample that I pulled, but looking at things like, in this current state, first life, sort of, obviously most, if not all, outdoor brands have some kind of warranty at this point, but then there's also repair facilities like Rainy Pass Repair. I know in Seattle, I've worked with in the past. Mountain Soles and Outdoor Threads, I believe, is one in Portland. And then there are rental programs through our REI Co-op or this online company called Arrive Outdoors. Of course, we all know programs like Warnware, Out and Back, you'll hear more about from Baruch. And then another player in that space is Recurate. So they're basically all kind of using different models to recapture products and resell them again, giving them a second life or additional lives for consumers. And then there's also, other secondhand sales channels like these sort of outdoor gear swap locations. There's a great one also in Boulder that I use all the time called Boulder Sports Recycler, which is amazing as well. And then tons of different materials recycling innovators out there. I've just pulled two of the most sort of well-known names in the industry. One's called Worn Again and one's called Evernew, that are really looking at how to break down, in particular, some of these blended materials and kind of get at some of the sticky issues that are preventing us from, having the technology available to really to recycle more of these textiles today.